Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is Jesus Ministry Part 15. We're moving right along through the Gospel of Mark as Mark tells us the story of Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry. And today we're in chapter 3 of Mark, verses 13 through 19. And this happens to be the text where Mark tells us about Jesus appointing his apostles. Now, it's an interesting text because it introduces us to this idea of the apostles. Who were these guys, and why did Jesus appoint them? What did he appoint them to do? And what did they, in fact, do? It's a very crucial part of the larger story of the development of Christianity. So this is why all of the Gospels tell us about these guys, these apostles, and who they were and the sorts of things they did, because they were crucial to the development of Christianity in the first century and throughout history and even in our world today. So let's begin by reading our text, Mark chapter 3, verses 13 and following. And we'll be reading from the Simplified New Testament. Mark says, "One day, Jesus found a nice spot on the mountainside and called 12 of his followers to him. He appointed them as apostles. They would spend more time with him, learning about the kingdom, and when they were ready, he would send them out to preach. They would have powers similar to his, even the power to drive out evil spirits. Those he appointed to be apostles were Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee. He gave them the nickname Sons of Thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him." So let's think about what this text says and then see if we can figure out some little bit of information about this whole idea of apostles, apostleship, who they were, what they did, and all that. Okay? First, Mark tells us that as they were out one day, Jesus found a nice place where they could all sit down. And he selected 12 of his guys. He said, "Hey, yeah, Peter, Matthew, come on, follow me." And these were some of his disciples that he selected out of a much larger group. Now, I think that's important because the way the New Testament reads, the Gospels, sometimes it almost sounds like Jesus only had these 12 disciples. And, of course, that's not the case. He had, at times, many thousands of people who would follow him around. He regularly had probably 100 or more. And we know this because on the day of Pentecost, there was a group of disciples that numbered 120. And the apostles were part of that 120. So there was a much, a much larger group than just the 12 apostles. They were special guys that Jesus selected for some special training. Now, why would he do that? Well, a little bit of understanding comes from the word apostle itself. The English word apostle comes from the Greek word apostolos, and it means a person who is sent on a mission, given a job, said, "Hey, you, for instance, Peter, I want you to go and do this." Okay? Well, that's basically what the word means. But when you stop and think how the word has been used now over the centuries, it has come to have some very, very specific ecclesiastical meaning. Now, that's a very fancy word that means church, okay? It has church or theological meaning. An apostle is someone who was designated by Jesus to be a church leader and have some very specific authority and power. Okay, so in other videos, I have talked about the fact that there are no more apostles. And we need to understand that here right up front before we go any further into this, that Jesus chose these people, these 12 men, to be his apostles, to receive special training, okay? Because when he died, rose from the dead, and then ascended back to heaven, these were the guys who were going to take over and be the leaders of the church. Okay, that's what it amounts to. And they needed some special training. Okay? And so he selected them early in his ministry, and they were with him from the very beginning right up to the very end. So they were with him being trained for about 3 years so that they would have the ability to be the leaders of the Christian movement after Jesus was gone. And once those guys died, then there were no more apostles. Now, the Catholic Church is big about talking about apostolic succession, but the simple fact is that they just made that up. Okay, that's not in the Bible anywhere. There's absolutely nothing in the Bible about apostolic succession. Peter didn't appoint other people to be, or some other person to be an apostle in his place, so that when he died, there would still be an apostle. James, John, Matthew, Philip, Bartholomew, all these guys didn't appoint somebody to be an apostle after him or them, so that there would continue to be apostles. That's just not true. It didn't happen. There's no biblical record of that, no historical record of that. It didn't happen. There is no such thing as apostolic succession. The Catholics made that up so that they could claim that the Pope's authority to rule the church could be traced all the way back to Peter and those who successively followed him. And it just isn't true. It's just not true. Okay? It's not there. So I think it's one of those things we need, to let go of it. It may be tradition, and they may insist that it's good, but they have there's no basis for it anywhere. All right, so we need to let go of it. When those 12 men died, later in the 1st century, or just at the beginning of the 2nd century, is when John died, the last apostle, there were no more apostles. Okay, so these 12 guys were trained for a specific job, selected by Jesus, trained by Jesus, sent out by Jesus, and they did a very special work. Now, why was it necessary to do that? Well, because Jesus knew what the church was going to become. Okay, and he knew that if this Christian movement was going to survive, there were going to have to be some men, some strong, capable men who could be leaders and hold this thing together, who would be dedicated, completely dedicated, even to the point of dying if they needed to. Okay, fully and completely dedicated to the task of leading the church and establishing the church in the 1st century, so that it would grow and be strong. And in fact, they did that, didn't they? Because within 300 years, the Roman Empire basically had been converted to Christianity. That was amazing that happened. You see, but part of the reason it happened was because of the message of Christianity. And part of the reason it happened was because of the Apostle Paul, who was appointed also by Jesus a little later on. And then part of the reason was because of all of the apostles and the work they did throughout the world in the time that they had. So the success of Christianity can be traced back to these 12 guys and the very, very, very important work that they did. Now, there's some important lessons that we need to learn from all of this. Number one is that these guys were appointed by Jesus. So that makes them pretty special. Number two, they were trained by Jesus. And so that makes them pretty special. And number two, they were sent out by Jesus to do a very specific thing. And that makes them very special. They were special guys. Okay? They were not just, some guy who decided, I'm going to be an apostle, or the church said, well, we want you to be our apostle, or whatever. These were very specific guys who were selected by Jesus, trained by Jesus, sent out by Jesus, and there wasn't anybody else like them. All right, so that's the first thing. Second thing, the reason that they were selected and trained is because the new church was going to need spiritual leadership. Now, what is spiritual leadership? That's the ability to help people grow and understand and become more spiritual themselves. A spiritual leader is somebody who understands what's going on in the world, understands what's going on in people's lives, and can teach about Jesus, can preach about Jesus, can counsel people about their lives in relationship to Jesus and his teaching. Okay, and a spiritual leader is a person who makes a difference in people's lives, just like Jesus made a difference in the lives of the people he ministered to. All spiritual leaders, if they are in fact spiritual leaders, make a difference in people's lives, a good, important difference, helping them understand, helping them grow, helping them succeed, helping them become the people that God wants them to be. That's what spiritual leadership is. And in order to do it, you have to be trained. It is not something that you just know how to do. Okay? It's not like breathing. To be a spiritual leader, you have to be spiritually mature. That means you have to be older. And you have to have had some training. You see? That's why Jesus had these guys with him every day for 3 years. Because they needed that much time to learn, to grow, to develop, to finally understand. They go, oh, now I see. I get it now. They, excuse me, I apologize for my cough. They needed time to learn. And one of the things that I think we don't focus on enough today in the church is the time it takes for an individual to learn to be a spiritual leader. There are some churches out there that appoint elders to serve in a local church. And that's just a term. Elder is a term for spiritual leader, whether you say elder or bishop or pastor or overseer or shepherd. Those are all terms, 5 English words that come from 3 Greek words that all have to do with spiritual leadership. Okay? And then they're appointed to work in the church as spiritual leaders. Well, there are some churches that appoint men to that position who have no training at all. They're called lay leaders, and they have no formal training in Bible or ministry. They've probably gone to Sunday school for 20 or 30 years or longer. But is that really enough training? I mean, let's be honest, right? A lot of people who teach Sunday school, even the adult Sunday school classes, are not trained themselves. They don't always have any kind of formal training in the Bible. So you have people who don't have any training teaching people so that those guys who now have no real training can become spiritual leaders. What kind of sense does that make? That doesn't make good sense. But yet there are some churches that do that. Okay. One of the things we need to do is insist that people who are going to be spiritual leaders get some training in Bible, in ministry, and in counseling, so they actually have the skills they need to serve people, to minister to people, to make a difference in people's lives. You see, that's what Jesus was doing on a daily basis when he selected these apostles and had them with him so that he could teach them, so that they could watch him and listen. And then he gave them jobs to do. Go here and go there. And after a period of time, when he thought they were ready, he sent them out on practice preaching tours so that they, by themselves, could go out and preach and teach and minister to people. Then they came back and reported to him about how it went. And he helped them then and advised them and encouraged them. You see, he was training them so they could do the job that he was doing. You see, he knew he wasn't going to be around all the time. He knew he was going to leave. And so there had to be spiritual leaders. And so he spent time training spiritual leaders so they could do the job when he wasn't there anymore to do it. So in the church today, we need spiritual leaders who've been trained, who know the Bible inside and out, and who can teach, who can preach, who can counsel. That's the job of spiritual leadership. It is exactly the same job that the apostles did. Now, leaders today don't get to be called apostles. There are no more apostles because they're not selected, appointed, and trained by Jesus. Okay, so there are no apostles. But they're doing the same work. Spiritual leadership is what the apostles did. And so if a person today is going to be trained to be a spiritual leader, they need training in Bible, in ministry, in counseling, and those sorts of things, so they have the skill and ability to do the job. Now, one more thing that will probably come up at some point is you'll notice I keep saying the men. Jesus appointed 12 men. What about women? Why aren't there any women in there? Well, in the past, in Jesus' culture, they were a patriarchal culture, and you simply couldn't appoint a woman to an important position like that. It just couldn't be done. Okay? It wasn't allowed. All right? But we don't live in that time. We live in a time where women do all sorts of important jobs in government, in business, in education. They do all kinds of stuff. Medicine, right? Well, women are just as capable as men in just about every respect. So why do we keep saying men? Well, mostly just out of habit. Okay. Is there any reason a woman cannot be a spiritual leader? None that I can think of. The fact that her physical body is different from the physical body of a male doesn't make any difference. The fact that her psychological makeup is a little different, the feminine psyche is a little different from the male psyche, that's not enough of a difference to make a difference, to qualify or disqualify someone, okay? So I think the issue of whether or not a woman can be a spiritual leader hasn't got anything to do with those sorts of things, but it has to do with the spiritual maturity of the woman. Okay? Now, many people will be upset with me for saying this and say, well, there can't be women elders, but there can. There's nothing in the Bible that says that they can't. And I think there are several passages people would point to and say right there, but that's a misunderstanding of that text. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, they as long as a woman covered her head, which was part of a cultural feature of the first century, she was allowed to teach. There were women prophets in that time. And so that a prophet was certainly a spiritual leader. Okay, if a woman has the knowledge and the skill and the personality makeup to be a leader and to help people spiritually, I don't see why she can't. I will say this though, personally, I have never met a woman who was qualified to serve as a spiritual leader. Now, that may simply mean haven't met that many women who were spiritually mature and could serve as a spiritual leader. That's all that means. I haven't met one. Doesn't mean there aren't any out there. Okay? But I think it's time that we understand women can serve God just as fully and completely as a man can. But she's got to actually be qualified. And see, here's the thing. Most of the men who are appointed as spiritual leaders aren't qualified. And they shouldn't be messing with it. They shouldn't be doing the job because they don't know the Bible. They don't know how to counsel people. They can't preach. They can't teach. They don't know what they're doing. Most elders in most churches today simply serve as a board of directors who sit around and make decisions, and they're not out serving the people. Well, they're not qualified to be spiritual leaders. So why does it matter that they're a male? If you're qualified to be a spiritual leader, then lead, whether you're officially appointed in that capacity or not. See, most men who are appointed as spiritual leaders, appointed as elders, they have no business being appointed as such because they don't have the skill and the training, the education. They're not doing the job because they have no training. So it's one of the problems we have in the church today. And it's sad that we have that problem. But what we need to understand, what we need to begin doing in our generation, is teaching men that if you want to be a spiritual leader, you need some training. And you need to set aside time and money to get the training you need so that you can be a spiritual leader and make a difference in the world and in the kingdom of God. Well, think about these things for the next few days. Pray about them. As you think about them, pray about them. Ask God to give you wisdom. And then just in general, read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.